Mr. Vaughn, we just changed tapes, and I'd like you to continue. You just said that at that point you met Curtis LeMay. Would you tell us about that?
Well, it's interesting. The 58th Bomb Wing of the 20th Air Force, of course, had several generals over this period of time. But the one that probably had the biggest impact on our whole effort was Curtis LeMay. And as I mentioned earlier, we've been flying these missions to Japan at altitude. The bombing results were not spectacular. They were hitting some targets, but they were not spectacular. The cost of the mission versus the results was not really on a favorable note. And part of the problem was the weather over Japan was also pretty bad. Weather there, a lot of high winds, what we now refer to as the jet stream. And so if you're bombing from 25,000 feet, then the circular error probability is enormous. That is, the bombs are influenced by the wind. Even with the best of bomb sites, it's very, very difficult to bomb that accurately at that point in time with that technology. So, Mr. Curtis LeMay came on the scene, and I will never forget the first time that we were introduced to his tactics or his strategy. Now, before any mission, we always had what they call a briefing. And we used to love these briefings because the briefing officer would always stand up there and say, well, men, here's your target for today, and you're going to go this, and you're going to do that. And he said, I wish I could go with you. And we would always say, we wish you could too. But anyway, we walked into the briefing one night, and they tried to plan these missions so that the B-29s could take off in the daytime, where the pilots would have the benefit of daylight visibility, and get up to Japan and get back in the daytime. So what this meant was that you generally would be over Japan around midnight, 1, 2 o'clock in the morning. The reason for that is, again, that the B-29 was a tricky airplane to fly. It took a lot of runway, and a lot of people had problems coming back with it. They had been shot up to some extent, had engine problems, maybe the landing gear didn't work, the hydraulics didn't work. So to give them the benefit of daylight, most of these missions were planned so that we would be over Japan at night. That also changed the tactics, because prior to that time, most of the bombing missions had been with heavy explosive or demolition type bombs. And generally these would be anywhere from 500-pound bombs to 1,000-pound bombs, but they would be demolition type bombs. Well, Curtis LeMay came on the scene, and I guess the Joint Chiefs of the people in Washington had looked at the strategy, and they had looked at what happened in Germany with firebombing and the results they'd had with bombing Dresden and Cologne and places like that with incendiary type bombs, plus the fact they had come up with a bomb which really was a precursor of napalm. And so the strategy changed. They decided they would not be concerned about consequential damage in terms of civilian casualties or anything like that, because that had to be a consideration in bombing Japan, because Japan, their military industry was dispersed among the civilian population. You had a lot of mom and pop shops that were making aircraft parts and things like that. So it changed the whole strategy, and they figured that incendiary bombing would be ideal because of the construction of the houses and buildings in Japan. They were highly flammable. They didn't have a lot of fire alleys or fire breaks or things like that, and a lot of limited fire equipment. So the decision was made to start using these incendiary type bombs. Well, to make it even more significant, General LeMay decided there's no point in trying to fly 25,000 feet at night and bomb from that altitude. We're going to fly up there at 7,000 and 8,000 feet. Well, the first time we were briefed and told that we were going to go up there and fly at 7,000 and 8,000 feet, you could hear repercussions all through the room. Everything from, oh no, the guy's out of his mind, he's crazy. So it didn't get a warm reception from the crews that had to do that. That puts you in range of everything the Japanese had in the way of firepower. They could throw rocks at you practically, you know. But it started the incendiary campaign against Japan, which really was started in 1945, probably around about April of 1945. And it was intense. Every day or two, every day there was some bombing raid on Japan, on the industry. But it was also very effective because they literally burned Japan down. That's what they did. And it burned down their capability to produce military equipment, aircraft, things like that. So we started flying these missions, and most of them again were at night. Generally speaking, the biggest problem was with the airplane itself. Still had a lot of problems with the B-29 at that point in time, a lot of engine problems and things like that. So that was a continuing problem. The raids over Japan, it would depend on what the target was and where you were and how you had to go into the Japanese Empire. They tried to plan these missions so that your exposure to anti-aircraft batteries and things like that would be minimal. And the people that planned these missions did a really good job as far as I'm concerned. They had excellent intelligence and did a great job because they would try to take you away from any concentration of Japanese fighter aircraft or things like that. But by flying at night, that pretty well took the Japanese Air Force out of the picture. They didn't have that many night fighters. But they did have some, but they didn't have that many. But the biggest problem was anti-aircraft fire. And the Japanese had radar-controlled searchlight and anti-aircraft batteries. It was German technology, of course. But they had that working for them. So a lot of these missions, they would pick out one or two planes and get them in the searchlights and then concentrate on them. And the Japanese were smart. They would take another plane or two and they'd fly right along beside the formation, and they would call it into the ground and tell you what the altitude was, what the airspeed was, what the heading was, and they'd give the anti-aircraft batteries all this information so they could really come in on you. So the missions were not milk runs, as a lot of people refer to them. They were not milk runs, and a lot of planes were shot down.
Did you lose many friends?
Yeah,
They were in there?
quite a few. Again, it depended on the target. And as the war went on forward, as we got on into July and August of 1945, then there was a big noticeable difference in drop in the opposition. Where we used to have a lot of, not the first line fighters like the Japanese Zero, which is really a Navy aircraft, but we noticed a marked reduction in the number of interceptors that the Japanese would put up there to try to intercept you. Found out later that what they were doing was keeping these aircraft because they were storing them for the invasion, which they felt sure was to come. So the Japanese, we were killing the Air Force, the Japanese Air Force. I say we were. The Navy and the Army Air Force were just absolutely destroying the Japanese Air Force at this point in time. In the meantime, and one of the big things that really helped out was the fact that the 3rd and 4th Marine Division had taken Iwo Jima. And that made a big difference. And I'll come back to that point in a second. But by taking Iwo Jima, we had escorted a squadron of P-51s, which is a Mustang, and P-47s, which was the Thunderbolt, as the pilots used to love, and they called it Jug. And we had escorted them up there to Iwo Jima, and they were stationed there. So at the latter part of those incendiary missions, a lot of times some of the groups would have fighter escort. But there's a lot of times when the fighter escort would take off and get about halfway up there and run into weather, and they couldn't handle it, and they had to turn back. So I don't recall, but maybe one time that I ever saw a P-51 escort on our missions. I'm sure that they were very effective when they were there because, like I say, they were destroying the Japanese Air Force. That was the best plane, the best fighter plane that we ever had in World War II was a Mustang. So anyway, we started flying these missions, of course, and just methodically burning out the Japanese industry. Sometimes the targets would be repeat targets 3 or 4 times, like Nagoya or Tokyo or places like that, where you wouldn't get it done the first time. They'd go back and bomb them again. We were quite fortunate. We never really had anybody that was hurt. We were hit with flak a lot of times, but the plane would take a lot of punishment, like a B-17 would, and unless you actually got hit, or you injured personally, we didn't have any real big problem from that standpoint. We were quite fortunate.
Were you able to look down and see the result of your bombing?
I could, because where I was sitting on the forward part of the plane, when they opened the bomb bay doors, I had a great view of where we had been. And of course, with firebombing, all you would see is a whole mass of flames down there. It would be intense. It was like having the whole town on fire. And the thing that was memorable to me was the fact that you could smell it. You could smell the smoke and everything. And if you were in one of the squadrons that came along subsequent to the initial assault, the turbulence of flying over that target with all that flame and intense fire, the turbulence was so rough that it would just toss the plane around. It was very difficult to hold the plane on a bomb run and fly across that target area. But the Japanese use sandalwood, as I recall, a lot of what they call sandalwood, and you can smell it. It has a very distinct odor. And that was the one thing I'll never forget, is the smell of that burning wood down there. But when you're doing that kind of bombing, you really can't assess the effectiveness of it because it's so generalized. If you had a target, and by the way, every one of these raids, they were not random in terms of just bomb the city. They were smart enough in every case to pick out a target and say, this is our target, like it could be a Mitsubishi engine plant or something like that, which is the primary target. But I'd say probably, in reality, probably 50% of those bombs, didn't even come close to hitting that target. But the end result was the same, because they burned down the cities and those industries were destroyed.
When was your highest degree of fear during your flights?
Having to bail out and getting shot down over Japan, because B-29 crews were not treated too kindly. A lot of crews that did go down had some pretty bad treatment. Some of them were beheaded. I've got a friend that had to bail out, and he said that when he hit the ground, there was already a crowd of Japanese, around him because they could see his parachute. And he said the first thing he remembered was that some guy came at him with a bayonet and tried to bayonet him. And he was able to jump to the side, and it just tore his jacket, and then somebody grabbed the guy. He had his pistol, but he said the first thing he did was threw that thing away. He wanted to make sure that they didn't think he was armed. He survived it, but that was the biggest fear. We just felt like if we ever had to go out and get shot down with Japan or something like that, that we would, our goose would be cooked, so to speak. Other than that, the other fear, of course, was having to ditch the airplane somewhere between Japan and the Marianas. Because again, if you had to ditch the airplane, ditching, of course, it means landing in the water. The plane would float for about maybe a couple of minutes. So you had plenty of time to get out of it. But then again, the chances of being rescued was not in your favor. The Navy saved a lot of crews because on the later missions, the Navy would put submarines. They would station submarines along the flight path. And some of these submarines were as close as like 4 or 5 miles off the Japanese coast. And so if you went down in the water, at least with those submarines, you had a good chance of being picked up. And they did save a lot of crews. A lot of them were not that fortunate. But that's why I say these missions were pretty well planned as far as supporting the mission as well as they could. But there was always that fear of having to leave the aircraft, under bad circumstances. Now, that brings up one of my favorite subjects. That gets back to Iwo Jima. We had several times where we lost engines and had insufficient fuel to get back and had to land at Iwo Jima. And if we had not had that facility available, then we'd have had a tough road to hoe because chances of being rescued would be pretty bad. So we always felt like that we owed the Marine Corps.
That was probably one of the key battles of the war, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And one of the worst ones for the guys that were
Yes.
involved with it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but
I understand completely. That a lot of lives were lost on Iwo Jima.
every time I think about it, I just get teary. I can't help it. But we were there several times out of necessity. And I took some really good pictures up there the last time we were up there. We went back in August, and we went back up to Iwo Jima and flew out of there on a search mission looking for some B-29 crews that were down. And if you ever have to find somebody that's in the ocean, a crew that's down in the ocean, it is tough to try to find them, unless they've got flares or signal mirrors or something like that. It is just really hard to do. We went up there to look for this crew that was down, and we searched out there for about 6 hours. And when you do this, of course, you've got a prescribed search pattern. So you essentially pick out a rectangle, if you will, and you bracket it back and forth, back and forth. And if there's any chop on the water at all, it makes it even more difficult because white caps, make it difficult to see anybody. And of course, most people that were on that cruise realize that your best friend, if you ever went down, your best friend was a simple mirror. Just a simple signaling mirror. Yeah.
The reflection of the sun.
Yeah, because you could take a signal mirror, and if you had a search aircraft out there, you could at least focus it on him. And that saved a lot of people's lives. Well, now, when we were at Iwo, on the last time we were there, and we were there about 2 or 3 days, one thing that impressed me was the horse trading that went on. There was a lot of horse trading. And while we were up there, of course, we were tented up there in a tent area. And I had traded for a Japanese suicide grenade, which had been defused, of course, or at least I always thought it was. And these were interesting devices because what they were used for was for the Japanese to kill themselves. They were not like an American pineapple or fragmentation type grenade. These were just a piece of steel that you put upside your head and blow your head off. Well, also while we were up there, we found out that, we found out that there were still a lot of Japanese holdouts up there. There were a lot of holdouts still. But we found out that there were several caverns or caves on the island where the Japanese had really dug in. It was unbelievable. It looked like an anthill where there were tunnels everywhere. And we found out that there was one tunnel there that really had served as an underground hospital, a Japanese hospital. So it was off limits, and we weren't supposed to be in there, even get close to it, really. But being young and foolish and all that, we figured, well, this ought to be something interesting. Maybe we can go and find some souvenirs. Everybody was souvenir crazy about it at that point in time. So 3 of us went down there and went into this cave that was supposed to have been an underground hospital. Well, when we got in there, the stench was so bad we couldn't go in there. So being innovative, we went back to the airplane and got our oxygen mask and our walk-around bottles and took them back in there and went down to this cave and went in there. And Joe, I tell you, it was unbelievable, just unbelievable. Here's this humongous cavern that was carved out of the coral that the Japanese had dug out. And there were dead Japanese soldiers all over the place. This was like a hospital. And there were still bodies on the operating table and medical equipment around and things like that. And we just figured that, we ought to have a field day in here and finding some good souvenirs. But I don't know. I guess after really seeing the magnitude of it and having it hit home, we just decided that this is not the thing to do. And we wasn't going to disturb those bodies and do something like that. So we came out of there. But the story was that those Japanese would not surrender. And they had pumped JP-1 fuel in there, into that cave, and thrown a satchel charge in there. And they were asphyxiated. It asphyxiated them. There was no damage to the bodies. I mean, you couldn't see any damage to them. They were just asphyxiated, that's all. But all of that really kind of brought back the fact that what it cost to really take Iwo Jima, and how many B-29 crews were saved because because of the Iwo Jima was there. And it left a very indelible impression on me. And I'm sure anybody that benefited from that would felt the same way.
It probably kept us from having to invade Japan in the long run. Do you
Well,
think? Possibly.
It certainly was a step along the way.
Speaking of that, where were you when you heard that the atomic bombs had been dropped?
About halfway between Japan and Tinian, coming back from a mission. And that was the mission to Imabari that I mentioned something earlier about having some Japanese guests over here from Imabari. That was the day that we were coming back from Imabari when the Enola Gay was going up. And that brings up an interesting little story. There was two airfields on Tinian. The one called the West Field and one called the North Field. Well, we were flying out of the West Field, and I think it was the 73rd Bomb Group, no, it was the 315th that's flying out of the North Field up there. Well, the word had gotten around that the food up there was a lot better. You know, they had better food than we did. So it was only about a couple of miles to walk up there. So we started walking up there, you know, and the food was better. It really was. So we noticed there was a B-29 off to the side over there that it was different. It didn't have guns or anything on it. And we were trying to figure out what it was for. And also there were armed MPs out there with Thompson submachine guns, and you couldn't even get close to that airplane. Now we figured, well, what in the world could it possibly be? Some kind of photographic, you know, mission or something like that, something out of the ordinary. And we never knew what it was until after the, I guess it was the 8th or the 9th of August. Then we found out it was Enola Gay.
Wow.
So all that time, the atomic bomb had been sitting up there on North Field, and it was probably the best kept secret of the whole war. Nobody knew what it was or what it was for or anything like that, other than the fact it was different, and you couldn't get close to it. But the food was good. And that was more important to us than anything else. So we had gone up to Imabari and bombed Imabari that night, and were coming back when the Enola Gay was going up. And we heard about it before we ever got back to the airfield.
What was your feeling when you heard that?
We didn't know the impact of it at that point in time. We didn't really realize the impact of it. Only that it was different, and that they had dropped an atomic bomb, but we didn't know what an atomic bomb was. So we had no idea what the real impact of it was. And of course, the Japanese military did not capitulate on that. It took the raid on Nagasaki to bring them to the point where they really had to capitulate. But we flew one mission after that, after the bomb was dropped. And I forgot just exactly where we went. But if there ever was what you call a milk run, that was it. There was just no opposition of any kind whatsoever. Again, looking back on it, I always use the 8th Air Force and the B-17's experience in Europe as a benchmark. And I don't think that we ever had it as rough as they did over these targets, because they just weren't as well organized as the Germans were. And the opposition, their missions were all in the daytime, most of them in the daytime. So they really caught the brunt of it. We were more fortunate in the fact that we were flying most of our missions at night. Now, one thing that we did run into that was different, that was unusual, we found out there was something that the Japanese had that we called them Foo Fighters, of all things, Foo Fighters. And what it was, the Japanese had come up with a ramjet type aircraft, which was called a Baka bomb, B-A-K-K-A, a Baka bomb. And the Baka bomb had a suicide pilot and had a TNT charge in the nose of it. And it was really a jet engine. And they would launch these things at night, and you could see them. You could see a red glow out there. You know what it was. After a while, we finally figured out what they were. And their whole intent and purpose was to try to ram one of the B-29s, to ram them. And we were coming out of there one night, and we had one of them, on our tail. And Mr. Cool, the pilot, he told the tail gunner, he says, well, when you think that guy gets too close, you let me know. And so the tail gunner's name was Marshall. He says, well, I don't know how far he is, but says the red glow is getting bigger. He says, well, when you think it's too close, let me know. So pretty soon he says, I think he's too close. And he stood that thing up on the wing, I mean vertical, and did a hard bank, and that guy went screaming by, And I don't think that the Japanese were too successful in bringing down many B-29s with a Baka bomb. They were not maneuverable. You had to actually fly right up a guy's tail end, but it was interesting because it was different. And a lot of the Japanese pilots were suicidal, which is part of the culture, really. And on a lot of the missions, we used to call them fishermen, because they would fly above the formation, and they'd have a 500-pound bomb on a cable, just like trolling, and they'd just try to fly across the formation with this bomb, hoping they could hit an airplane.
Huh.
Well, we've seen them, but we were lucky. They had never hit us. And then, of course, they would fly above us and drop bombs to try to, hit a plane by dropping a bomb on it. We took more problems with the fighters. In fact, our top gunner shot down a Japanese fighter. He got credit for a Japanese fighter. But the thing about the B-29 that was different was that it had the first really automated fire control system. That plane had, let's see, 4, 6, 8, really had 12 50 caliber machine guns on it. 12 50 caliber machine guns. And if you can visualize a bunch of planes flying in formation, where that all planes have got a field of fire where they can concentrate that many machine guns, and most planes had at least 5 or 6 plane formations. So you're talking about a lot of firepower. And if you could ever get on a fighter with that much firepower, it was toast. Just no way. And the Japanese learned real quick, that they couldn't make many passes on a B-29 without really getting shot up. We were flying up there one day on a daylight mission, and we started getting hits. And we were flying in formation at that time. And when you're flying in formation, you've usually got 2 planes, they're stacked. They're stacked vertically, and they're spread out horizontally. So you've got 5 planes in a formation, but the way they're flying, they've all got a clear field of fire. Anyway, we started getting hits, and we had fighters out there, so we figured we were getting shot by these fighters. And everybody kept saying, well, where are they? Where are they? Are we getting slammed with these? You can feel the impact. Finally, we realized that this guy up there at the very top is firing his tail turret, and we're getting the 50 caliber spent shells, we're hitting the airplane. That plane came back with dings all over it.
You mentioned something in the break. I just wanted to ask you this question and have you address it. Were you with the same crew the whole time?
Yes.
You were.
Well, no, basically yes, but probably on our 31st, 30th, somewhere along in there, we had I'm glad you asked that. We had another pilot come on board. We had a colonel. His name was, I can't think of his name off the top of my head. He was redheaded, I remember that, I know that. Anyway, we had this guy that was going to fly one of the missions with us. And the reason was that our pilot was winding up his missions, okay, early. So we were taking off from Tinian, and we were carrying the heaviest bomb load we'd ever carried. I think the plane weighed 145,000 pounds with a bomb load on there, which is above the rated load for the plane. So if you're familiar with aviation in airports, runways have got double stripes when you get down to the end of the runway. And we got down to the last double stripe, we were still on the ground. And this old boy says, well, it's now or never. So he yanked back on the control yoke, you know, and the plane tried to lift off the ground. Well, there was a Marine anti-aircraft battery right off the end of the runway down there. And they had a cook stove or something, had an aluminum pipe out there about 15 feet in the air. We took it with us. We literally took that pipe down, and we were taking off on Tinian downhill. So when we hit the coast, we were still about 10 feet off the ground maybe, and we got a good updraft that just helped the plane get up off the ground. But we thought we were going to buy the farm right then and there because we were not getting off that ground. If we'd been taken off the other way, we never would have made it. And a lot of planes crashed on takeoff. A lot of planes crashed on takeoff. More than you would imagine. You'd think that'd be the easiest part of it, but it isn't.
When you were over in the action, when you were running over the hump and you were bombing over Japan, did you realize you were part of maybe one of the most significant events in world history, you know, World War II?
Not really. I think most of us had on two things on our minds. One is survive it, and go home. And that was about all we really thought about at that point in time. See, you know, people don't realize, but people on crews that are at a lower level in the hierarchy of the organization, they don't know the strategy or the tactics or the objectives. They're just instruments to be used along the way. And there's nothing wrong with that. You've got to have that. But I don't think anybody had any instinct or any idea at all that we were creating history or a part of history or anything like that. So to answer your question, I'd say no.
And when did you go home?
Well, it turned out that after we had our last mission, we had our mission count in. And by the way, we got some credit for the missions across the hump. So in actual combat missions, we probably flew 27 or 28. But we got about 5 or 6 mission credit for all those hours across the hump there. So when you had a score of 35, that gave you enough points to go home. So the way it worked out was that generally speaking, nobody really knew when they were going to go. And somebody from headquarters operation would come into the tent or into the, oh, by the way, at the end in Tinian, we had Quonset huts. We finally graduated from tents and had Quonset huts, which was a real improvement, believe me. But the guy would come in and say, so-and-so says, your orders to ship out here in about an hour, be at the flight line and get your stuff from down there. Nobody ever missed. Nobody ever missed those trips, I guarantee you. So that's what happened. The pilot, the co-pilot, and myself, we had enough mission credit to go out at the same time. The rest of the crew stayed put till they got around to them. And
when you got home, did you exit the military, or were you discharged when you got back to the United States?
But what we did, they flew us from Tinian down to Guam. And we stayed at Guam for about 2 days to start processing out. A lot of paperwork and everything, of course. And we flew from Guam to Enola Gay Atoll, which is nothing more than just a finger of coral out there in the ocean. Enough for a runway is about what it boils down to. And then from Enola Gay we flew into Hickam Field, which was in Hawaii, of course. And that's the first time that we ever had steak in a couple of years. And man, I'm telling you, the food over there was spectacular. We probably all gained 15 pounds in one night. Well, we didn't stay there, but just overnight practically. And so we flew from there to Hamilton Air Force Base in California, which is north of San Francisco. And another one of the emotional experiences, of course, was seeing the Golden Gate Bridge. Oh, I'm telling you, that was quite an experience. So we landed at Hamilton. That started the discharge process, really. And we were given liberty. Of course, we called it leave in the Air Force. We were given leave to go down to visit San Francisco. Well, you know, when you come out of where we'd been for the last couple of years and get back into civilization, it's overwhelming. But the thing that just really blew me away was that when we got off that bus in San Francisco and got downtown, all you could see was white. It was Navy uniforms. There was 50 jillion sailors in there. I'm not kidding you. I've never seen so many sailors in one place in all my life. So we tolerated them.
Put up with them.
Didn't get into any bar brawls or anything like
That's
that.
good.
But stayed in Frisco there, in Hamilton about 2 or 3 days. Then they took us back down to Frisco and we got on a train. And this was a typical train ride back at that point in time. I think it took about 5 days from the West Coast to come back to Atlanta. And that was a wild ride, I'll tell you right now. That was a wild ride. But got back into Atlanta at the old Union Station, probably sometime around the 15th of September. And then, of course, I had to go out to Fort McPherson for being discharged. And my biggest regret in this whole story is that I had a barracks bag, which a lot of military guys know what a barracks bag is. And I had almost a brand new .45 Colt revolver, not a revolver, a pistol. I had a Colt pistol, had a parachute, all that flying paraphernalia. And like an absolute dummy, I turned it in. And I regretted that. For 60 years, I've regretted that. I didn't mind losing the parachute, but I sure did hate to lose that Colt pistol. I would love to have that thing today. So, again, I only lived about a quarter of a mile from Fort McPherson. So that sort of ended the story, really, you know, and that was the end of it.
Well, that's quite a story. I want to ask you one more thing before we wrap up. You mentioned earlier, before we started, and I think you mentioned it when you were talking about some of your runs, about interviewing or being interviewed by some Japanese students recently.
Yeah.
Could you briefly tell us about that?
Yeah, this all came by way of the internet. I got an email one day from a guy named Fujimoto. I think that's like Smith or Jones in English, you know, Fujimoto is. And he said that he was a Japanese high school teacher in Imabari. And they were doing a research project on that bombing raid and a lot of the other Japanese history over there from the war. And would I be willing to meet with them and kind of relate my experiences to them? Well, I was a little reluctant to do that in a way because I wasn't real sure I wasn't sure what the attitude would be. I had no idea what the attitude would be, but I thought about it for a while and I said, well, gosh, if they're taking the trouble to do something like this is something nobody else has ever done that I'm aware of, and I'll go along with them. So they flew from Narita Airport, which is Tokyo, straight into Atlanta on Delta. It's a 7,000-mile trip. And he brought 2 young men and 2 young ladies, himself, and a newsman from Japan. So I met him out at the airport, and I stayed with him for about 5 days. I was lucky enough to be able to, I'm a graduate of what's now Southern Polytech. And they were good enough to give me a meeting room over there, so we had the interview at the college out there, Southern Polytech. And it was interesting. It took me off balance a little bit. I expected them to want to know more about the details of the actual raid, but they were more interested in what my attitude was. They were more interested in how I felt about being part of somebody that killed a bunch of civilians, because Imabari took a big loss in civilian life there, and that took me a little off balance. But as I told them, I said, you know, when you get right down to it, we did not know You know, there's no way we could know how many people were killed in a raid like that. We never had that kind of feedback. And it wasn't that we were out intentionally trying to kill civilians, but as I pointed out to them, I said, you know, in any war, people get killed that are totally innocent, that have no part in it, they didn't start it, they didn't promote it, they're just victim of circumstances, being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I said, that's the only way you could look at it. You know, there was nothing deliberate about it. You know, we were not out to kill all the Japanese civilians if we could or anything like that. And that seemed to satisfy them. But then, of course, they wanted to know about the actual experience itself. And it wasn't one of the more profound missions, you know, like some of the earlier ones were.
How much did they know about World War II?
Little or nothing. And that surprised me. Little or nothing. The high school teacher was very fluent in English. In fact, he teaches English. He's been teaching English for 18 years over there. The two young men, it was difficult to communicate with them. He could interpret, but I had a hard time understanding them in their attempt to speak English. They had a long way to go. Of course, I spoke no Japanese at all, so I didn't know nothing. But one of the young ladies had lived in New Zealand for 8 years, and she was fairly conversant. So we didn't have any problem in communicating between the crowd there.
Well, you've got an amazing story, and before we finish, I want to, number one, see if anybody else has any questions to ask, or if there's anything else you'd like to add to what you said.
Well, well, looking back on it, of course, it was probably one of the most memorable, somewhat exciting periods of my life. It had its highs and lows. The high point, of course, was getting out alive. That certainly was a high point. And the low point was not being able to be involved in it in the way that I wanted to, and that is in pilot training. You know what, it's always irony. It's bitter irony to me, even at this point in time. I have a hard time sometimes dealing with it. When I was in high school, Tech High School, I took 2 years of aviation shops. I took courses in navigation, building engines, everything that you could just about do with an airplane. And the instructor was a guy named Willie J. Ward, who was a World War I aviator. So I had great training, plus the fact that I had a friend that had an aeronica out at what was then Candle Field. So he let me take lessons in his aeronica. And I was taking flying lessons from Bill Hale, who was an Eastern Airlines pilot. So when I went into service, I already had navigation, I'd been flying, and that one stupid chart, one chart that got me thrown out of it. And to me, that was just bitter irony. And I ended up flying on a crew anyway, because I am not colorblind. I can tell red and green all day long. But if you mix up red, green, and brown, there's some combination of colors there, you know, that make it difficult. And then the other part of the story is that my best friend, who went with me to the Navy recruiting station, used to be across from WSP down there, used to be a car dealership that was in that building. He went ahead and passed it and got in, and opted to go to the Navy, and went to Athens pre-flight school up there, and got his flight training, and opted to go into the Marine Corps aviation. And went to the Pacific as a F-4U fighter pilot, a Corsair. That's the gull wing plane that the Marine Corps flew. And he was killed at New Georgia Harbor. And never knew what happened to him. They were in a scramble with Japanese fighters with Zeros. They were escorting some dive bombers to attack Japanese ships in that harbor. And of course, when you get into a scramble like that, people lose touch with each other. And when it all was over, and the sides, you know, were going back to the bases, they couldn't find him. There had been no radio communication with him or anything like that. And they, to this day, they don't know what happened, except that they had seen one Corsair flying low over the water, smoking. And they figured that had to be him. But whatever happened from that point on has been a big mystery. His name was Charles Lassiter. And he was enrolled at Georgia Tech at that time. He was a year ahead of me. But he went ahead and got out of Georgia Tech, stopped his schooling, and went into the Marine Aviation, and was one of the unfortunate ones that was killed. Now, if I had not been colorblind, I might have been right there with, I probably would have been with Charlie. So you just never know what kind of cards you're going to draw in situations like that.
Just a comment, Reed. My father-in-law was a submariner. He was a machinist mate on the USS Tyrone, and that was their mission, pick up B-29 pilots in the Pacific. And I'm going to recount to him your comments about.
Oh, listen, we felt like those guys were the, they were angels. They really were. Because first of all, to be that close to Japan, be that close offshore, they were at higher risk themselves. And they were surfaced. They wasn't sitting down there at periscope depth. They were surfaced on station. And their duty was to stay on station until that mission was completely over and every B-29 had left Japan. And that's a tall order.
Well, we want to thank you, number one, for taking the time to come in here and share your experiences, but mainly we want to thank you for what you did for the country. I mean, you're a hero as far as we're concerned.
Well, I appreciate your interest.
Wow.
I appreciate your interest. With the exception of the Japanese, you're the only people that I've ever really talked about this to. And again, I have to go back to Iwo Jima. Every time I think about that, it just really floods me. I tried to figure out how to control that, but I hadn't figured it out yet.
Well, I don't think there's any reason to control it, because it's good that you appreciate what those men did for us.
Well, it's honest. You know, it's honest emotion. And every time I get around, I had the experience to go to Lockheed has a management club, and they bring in guest speakers sometime. And when I went to make a presentation to the Lockheed club out here, been some months back, the very first thing I asked them was, is anybody in here from the 3rd or 4th Division? And there was. So, you know, I always thank them personally. Yeah. Every time I see them.
Well, we thank you. At this point, we'll conclude the interview, and thank you again very much.
I think it's been interesting. I mean, I hope it's been interesting for you.
It's been fascinating for all of us.
Ask me next year, and the stories will get even better next year.
We'll do it again next year.